What would you do if you saw your own funeral on the road? A ghostly procession led by a coffin, funeral bells tolling in the wind. Because to see such a thing is no blessing, it's an omen of your own death. Phantom funerals and death omens are part of British culture, but what's really uneasy and unsettling is that they are carved into the landscape by our corpse paths. Real places made with fear, superstition, and built through ritual. These corpse paths remain as a reminder that they can be haunted still by the shadow of death.
This, my spooky friends, is the season of the dead, a journey through Britain's darkest places, as All Hallows Eve draws near, and the veil between the living and the dead trembles.
Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire. This is The Wanderlust Way. Firstly, let me say a huge thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, becoming members, sending super thanks, hyping the video. Honestly, everything that you guys are doing is helping this channel to grow. It's allowing me to carry on with adventures like this and share the stories that I find with you. Okay, so today we are on episode 3 of our Season of the Dead, weekly treats in the run-up to Halloween. Last week we looked at the revenants, the fear that the dead could rise from their grave and come back to haunt the village. Today we are in the beautiful Yorkshire Dales to visit the area's corpse paths. Here we are going to look at those rituals surrounding death, the superstitions that people of the day might have had, and we're also going to look at phantom funerals and death omens. So if you're ready for a little bit more spook, then pull up a chair, grab yourself a drink, maybe a pillow to hide behind, because that is enough waffle, or let's wander.
Here in the beautiful Yorkshire Dales, where one can immerse themselves in a landscape of lush valleys, dry stone walls and the occasional sheep, you can find the ancient funeral trail known as the corpse path.
For centuries, this path was the road for the dead. Locals would have used this passageway. They would have been very familiar with it if they wanted to bury their loved ones in consecrated ground.
The Swaledale Corpse Path spans approximately 16 miles, connecting the remote village of Keld with its neighbouring Grinton. The reason, you might wonder, is simple enough. Grinton was the closest place where consecrated ground could be found, a safe final resting place for the dearly departed. You simply wouldn't want to bury your loved one anywhere else if you knew what was best, for reasons which we will cover a little shortly. But first, to St Andrews.
St Andrew's Church sits in the remote village of Grinton. Now, for one time, it was the sole parish church for the entire vast area of Swaledale, earning it the nickname Cathedral of the Dales.
Parts of this beautiful church date back as far as the 12th century, and for many years it held the heart of the parish. Imagine what this place represented to the people who had walked all those miles with their loved ones on their shoulders.
St Andrew's Church today is a Grade 1 listed building, a very much an important part of history, and what's really nice to know is it's still being used by the community. We've just gone inside to try and have a look, and there is obviously something happening in there. There's people singing, there's lots of people meeting together, and it's lovely to see a church in Britain being still used in that way. Now, some fun facts about the church include that there are a 1718 pulpit inside, and that they have a Bible which is chained up, apparently. So that's just a little bit of a sign to the fact that faith is still very important, still very sacred in this community. Now, going back to the corpse path, I can only imagine, as I'm standing here now, that the sign of that tower, seeing that on the horizon as you are approaching after that long journey with the loved one on your back, I can imagine those church gates were just an absolute release.
The Corpse Road itself is rich in folklore and ghost stories. But before we get into that, let's look at the facts. First off, the journey. There's no denying that a procession like this was no easy fate. For the wealthier residents, a horse and a hearse might be an option, but for the majority of normal folk in the area, the options were slim. They were too poor to afford such luxuries.
Instead, they accepted their task and they looked for ways to make things a little bit easier. So they might use a wicker coffin, for example, instead of a wooden one, because of course it would be a lot lighter. And sprawled out across the corpse path, you'll see flat stones like this one, which they would use to rest the coffin upon while they themselves took a little bit of a breather. Now, heaven forbid they actually rest the coffin of their loved ones on the actual ground or on the earth, because no, they can't do that. That might cause an unnecessary haunting.
Whilst on the subject of hauntings, because this is after all almost Halloween and a subject we cannot avoid when on such a topic as corpse roads, let's discuss the necessary methods that people of these times would take to prevent the release of an uneasy spirit.
Now, first, the corpse path itself. This were not meant to be straight and simple, because the road to the afterlife isn't straight and simple. And on the corpse path, it was designed to go through rivers, over stiles, through crossroads even.
Folklore tells us that a restless spirit could only travel in a straight line. So, should a soul harbour thoughts of returning home, the path itself would confound it. A final safeguard against the dead walking back among the living.
And that was just one strand in a whole web of customs, rituals passed down through centuries to help the passage of a soul and to aid the living and protect the living left behind.
As soon as death struck, the household changed. Doors and windows were opened wide so the spirit might slip free. Knots were loosened, fires extinguished, clocks halted, all to sever ties with the world it was leaving. Mirrors were covered, veiled in black, for a fear that a soul might become snared in the glass. Funeral practices have always varied across time and place, but the message remained the same. Respect the dead and guard against their return. The Greeks said it was Hades himself who first taught mortals the rites of burial. A stern reminder that without them, no soul could rest. The Egyptians entrusted their loved ones to the spells of the Book of the Dead, charms and words of power to guide them safely through the underworld. The Vikings, like the Egyptians, sent their dead with offerings, food, drink, weapons, for the next world.
Here in Britain, families and neighbours would have gathered together to prepare their loved one for the road ahead. There would always have been a candlelit vigil around the corpse. It was not allowed to leave the corpse on its own. So day and night they would have took it in turns to sit there with their loved one and make sure that everything was okay. Now, to not do this was not only considered neglectful, but it was also a very dangerous risk.
These vigils offered companionship for the soul, protection against thieves and beasts, and reassurance that death was certain, for not everybody laid out in a shroud was truly gone.
Grim as this might sound to some people, I personally like the idea of what they used to do back then. So you've got families gathering together, performing a vigil by candlelight, there's a sense of community there. There's a sense of sharing your grief and working through it together. I know people do still obviously do that sometimes, but today in our modern world in Britain, we often entrust the care of our loved ones into the funeral parlour, and it's very, very different, the practices. I quite like the idea of the old ways. I quite like the idea of taking a more on-hands approach and being there in the process. What do you think? Am I being a bit grim, or do you like the idea of people sitting together around the body right up until the day of the funeral?
Other rites added their weight. The dead were carried feet first, so they could not look back. Coins were pressed into hand or mouth to pay their way across the shadowy threshold. And in pagan times, the coffin was borne part of the way in line with the sun's journey to keep the soul's welfare intact. For our ancestors, such rites were not optional. To omit them was to risk disaster, at best misfortune, at worst a soul unquiet condemned to wander, a haunting unleashed. As the season of Halloween approaches, we might start to talk about the possibility of spirits wandering the earth. We swap ghostly stories over a pint at the pub, or binge on movies from the terrifying lights of Poltergeist, The Conjuring, or Paranormal Activity, to the lighter, more playful side of Fright, Casper, Ghostbusters, even Beetlejuice. The ghosts we know today are, for the most part, entertainment. We've made amusement out of our fears. But we're not the first. Our ancestors swapped ghost stories too, not on Netflix, but by firelight. In the Victorian age, ghost tales became an obsession, but centuries before that, the fear of hauntings was deadly serious. It was the very reason some of those death rituals we've just spoken about were so carefully observed.
And of course, nowhere is more frightening if you are a believer in ghosts than the corpse path, because it is here that through history lots of people will have walked, and we now know the context of it all. So it is not surprising that on this road there have been signs of ghostly figures walking across the moor. There have been people that have heard funeral songs being muttered when there's nobody else about, and even the sound of church bells tolling on the wind when the church is clearly still a few miles ahead.
These were known as phantom funerals. They were not just ghostly diversions to frighten the unwary. They were omens. To see such a procession was to know a real funeral would soon follow. Sometimes it was even your own. One tale from Wales tells of a man walking home at dusk when he heard the slow tramp of footsteps on the road behind him. He turned and saw a full funeral procession, men carrying a coffin on their shoulders, mourners following, even the sound of a minister's voice drifting on the air. The man stood aside to let them pass, but as they came level with him, he realised something terrible. Among the mourners, he recognised faces from his own village, friends, neighbours, even his own kin, and in that moment the whole company simply faded into the darkness. Days later, a real funeral came. The same coffin, the same mourners, the same faces. The man had witnessed the procession before it happened, a ghostly rehearsal of death.
And so we return to the corpse path, to one of the most terrifying parts on this trail, the Iverlet Bridge, because it is here that one of the most frightening apparitions has been sighted. A headless black dog that is said to lay there in silence waiting, and then it jumps into the water. Now, if you are to see such an apparition, it's not a good sign, because it actually means that somebody close to you is about to die.
The corpse paths of Britain were more than routes for the dead. They became calendars of fate, where grief and prophecy walked hand in hand. And as our ancestors believed, the world itself was heavy with omens. A raven at the window, a candle guttering at the wrong moment, a clock chiming out of turn. Death made its approach known in whispers and signs. if only you had the courage to look for them.
We've seen how phantom funerals haunted the corpse paths of deathly processions that foretold of what was to come. But for our ancestors, this was just one tiny link in a whole web of death omens. For them, they saw death omens everywhere, in the rustle of the trees, in a flicker of a candle, even in birds sweeping overhead. Many things told them that death was coming.
Among the most recognisable omens in European folklore was the figure of the Grim Reaper. Cloaked in black, scythe in hand, he first appeared during the Middle Ages, when plague and famine stalked every village. To glimpse him, a shadow at the bedside, a shape at the edge of vision, was to know death was close. Today he lives on in Halloween masks and horror films, but once he was no joke. He was the human face of fear itself. But the Reaper was only one thread in a vast web of signs and superstitions. Imagine living in a world where everything seemed to whisper of death. An owl hooting outside your house, or a white hare crossing your path? Death. A gift of parsley, a primrose blooming in winter, even a butterfly seen at night? Death. A soot mark on the wick of your candle, a picture crashing from the wall, the shattering of a mirror? Also death. And it didn't end there. Even funerals themselves were thought to carry their own warnings. If the hearse horse refused to move, or if one turned its head and neighed at a dwelling along the road, well, you've guessed it, a death is coming. For our ancestors, life was a constant vigil, a world where every omen, every shadow carried absolute dread. And even now the whispers continue. Worldwide reports of shadow people, dark figures glimpsed at the bedside or standing silently in doorways. It seems they are on the rise. Scientists dismiss them as sleep paralysis, psychologists as grief or stress, but others believe they are true encounters, messengers from beyond, delivering a warning. Have you ever seen shadow people, and if so, did they appear more often during a certain event or a difficult time? Please feel free to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Believer, skeptic, or simply curious, all voices are welcome here. The more we talk about these things, the more we can understand how the modern world fits into these old stories. Our modern funerals and practices may look very different. It's a topic I've touched on before. Cemeteries lie closer to our homes, cremation is common, and much of the old ritual has been replaced with something more practical. But what's striking is how little remains to seal the dead away. Once, every superstition, from winding paths to coins for the journey, was about helping the spirit on its way and keeping it from returning. Today, stripped of those customs, we tend to rely on science, pragmatism and faith, yet the fears that once shaped those rituals still echo. Perhaps that's why we keep telling ghost stories, why we still feel uneasy on certain roads, and why the old omens never quite lose their hold. And maybe that is the bridge to Halloween itself, because what all these practices, beliefs and warnings were really about was negotiation with the dead, keeping them at peace, ensuring they did not trouble the living. And Halloween is the one night of the year when those negotiations are thought to be at their most fragile, when the veil is thought to thin and the dead may walk once more.
And so concludes our third episode in this season of The Dead. We are, of course, getting very close to Halloween now. Thank you to everybody for joining me on this week's episode. What did you think? Please let me know in the comments. Now, obviously, our ancestors took serious precautions to ensure the spirits were happy and that they didn't want to come back and haunt them. But what about if there was one night of the year where whatever they did, they could come back. So next week we are going to look into the dark origins of Halloween. I will be presenting that video to you next week for our 4th episode. Please feel free to join me if you are brave enough. Okay, so thank you to everybody once again. I've been Claire. This has been The Wanderlust Way. Stay safe, stay curious. I hope you don't have nightmares. Take care. Bye-bye.